My name is Brother Joe Hoover, and I will be reading about Saint Ignatius of Loyola in this book, Stories of the Saints by Carrie Wallace, illustrated by Nick Thornborough. Our story begins. Inigo loved to strut around the Spanish court, tossing his cape to reveal the chainmail he wore as a Spanish soldier and to show off the sword and dagger at his waist. He also loved fancy clothes, and to dance, and to gamble, and to read the stories of romantic warriors and tales about El Cid and Camelot. But he was also a good soldier. All the men he led loved and respected him, and in 10 years of fighting, he'd never been injured once. It all changed at the fortress of Pamplona. Inigo and his company were defending the fort from a French attack, and Inigo was right at the head of the Spanish force. During the battle, a cannonball was shot between Inigo's legs. It tore his left leg open and broke his right one. When Inigo's men saw he was injured, they surrendered to the French. But the French were so impressed by Inigo's bravery that they carried him on a stretcher all the way back to his hometown. Back home in the castle where he had grown up, Inigo went through terrible operations to fix his shattered legs. After months of pain, the doctors were able to patch up Inigo so he could walk, but one of his legs would always be shorter than the other, which meant he could never be a soldier again. During those days Inigo spent in the hospital, he asked for books filled with the adventure stories he loved to read, but the hospital didn't have any. Instead, they gave him the Bible and stories of the saints. As Inigo read them, he noticed something. When he read adventure stories, he felt empty, but when he read stories of God and the saints, he felt peace. And so when Inigo could walk again, he went to a monastery at Montserrat. He gave away his fine clothes to a poor man he met there, and he stayed up all night, praying before a statue of Mary, carved from black stone. At the end of the night, he hung up his sword and dagger beside the statue and left behind his old life forever. And to illustrate this, Ignatius, the sword, the Madonna. A woman showed him a cave nearby where he could pray. And for the next year, Inigo lived there praying and fasting and serving at a hospital for the poor. In the cave, Inigo pondered the stories he knew about Jesus, but he didn't just think about them. He imagined what it would have been like if he had been there himself. He imagined seeing Jesus feed 5,000 people with only a few fish and loaves of bread. He imagined watching Jesus welcome the children who ran to him and seeing Jesus open the eyes of a man who had been born blind. Inigo wondered what he would have seen and heard if he'd been there, and how he would have felt. But he also struggled with fears and doubts. Do you really think you can follow God as long as you live? The devil whispered to him. Can you promise me even 1 hour of life? Inigo answered. At this, the devil slunk away. Even though he chased the devil off that day, Inigo still had spiritual struggles. Sometimes he felt no joy or comfort at all, no matter how much he prayed or went to church searching for God. But as he prayed, he started to realize that God was always there with him, even in the dark cave. And he realized that God spoke to him through both his hopes and his fears and all the other emotions. And if he thought about the things he felt and why he felt them, he learned things about himself and the world and God. Inigo started to write these thoughts down as a book, which he called Spiritual Exercises, to help other people listen for unexpected ways that God might speak. And he realized that if he wanted to teach people about God, he needed to learn a few things himself. Because he'd always been a soldier, he never bothered to study much. So when he went back to school to start his basic studies, he wound up in classes with boys who were only 8 or 10 or 12 years old. Several years later, he was finally ready to attend a university in Spain. When he wasn't taking classes, he and his friends loved to talk about God, and Inigo started to lead his friends in the spiritual exercises he had discovered in his cave. We should speak to God as a friend speaks to a friend, he said, or as a servant to a master. We should ask him for favors and admit our faults and tell him everything that concerns us, our fears and our hopes, and we should ask for his guidance in everything. But the leaders of the Spanish church weren't pleased that Inigo was teaching about God before he finished school. They had him arrested. When Inigo was set free, he went to a different town in Spain and got locked up for teaching about God there too. Finally, Inigo went to a university in Paris. He didn't know French, so he had to start his studies all over in a new language. 6 years later, he earned his degree in theology. He'd begun his education as a full-grown man in a classroom full of boys for over a decade. He hadn't given up, even when he had to begin again in a whole new language. Finally, he was a priest. So people began to call him Ignatius, the Latin form of his name. In Paris, Ignatius and his friends formed a group that called themselves Friends in the Lord and the Company of Jesus, like one of the military companies he used to fight for. They decided to go to Rome, ask the Pope if he would let them start their own religious order. Most religious orders had vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but the Company of Jesus added another vow to do whatever the Pope asked them and go wherever he said. The Pope blessed their order, and Ignatius's friends tried to elect him as the leader. I don't think I'm worthy, he said. I didn't lead a good life, and other people know so much more than I do. But his friends wouldn't take no for an answer, and finally Ignatius accepted. In Rome, Ignatius wrote the rules for their order, which were like the disciplines Ignatius knew from his days as a soldier. Hurry to any part of the world where our neighbors need us, he told his friends, and serve them without harsh words and without looking down on them for their mistakes. People started calling Ignatius and his friends the Jesuits, a shorter nickname for the Company of Jesus. And the Jesuits spread over the whole world, founding schools, while Ignatius built a network of love across the miles by sending thousands of letters. By the time Ignatius died as an old man, there were 1,000 Jesuits, and they had started 35 schools. And today, Ignatius's Company of Jesus serves people in hundreds of schools all over the world, and hundreds of thousands of people have read the little book of spiritual exercises Ignatius started to write all alone in his cave. The end.